All right, thank you very much for joining us. So today we're going to talk about localizing the battery supply chain. It's an issue at the core of the EV revolution. As demand for EV surges, so does the pressure on EV battery supply chains. And today's system is heavily reliant on cross-border flows and international suppliers, but geopolitical tensions, we know, are hindering cross-border supplies. So to help us explore this issue, we are really happy to be joined by three leaders shaping the future of this industry. So once again, we have Selina Mikowajczak from Lyten, US company, at the cutting edge of lithium-sulfur battery technology. Welcome. And we also have Katerina Uribe from Kuehne and Nagel, one of the world's leading logistics providers. And we have Stefan Yanis from Umicore, a global pioneer in sustainable battery materials and recycling. And today, in the next half an hour, we would like to explore the following topics. Why does localization matter? And what are the barriers and how to accelerate localization? And also, what does it mean for global EV battery supply chains? So before we get started, maybe very briefly, can each of you introduce what your company does, please? So shall we start with you, Selina?
Sure, yeah. So Lyten is trying to commercialize lithium-sulfur batteries. This is a new chemistry. The cathode material is sulfur. It is not cobalt. It is not a mixed metal oxide. It is a very different chemistry. Challenging, but the upside is huge. With lithium-sulfur, we're really aiming to get the performance levels that are comparable or above that of NMC or NCA at a price point that's low at or below LFP, and with a supply of sulfur that is very abundant in the world. So it's what we think of as when we want to talk about electrifying everything and making EVs affordable for the regular person. You really only get there if you can expand your batteries to include sulfur technology.
Stefan?
Yes, hi, good morning, everybody. Umicore is actually active in three main areas. First one is recycling, really recycling of approximately 23 different metals in our plant in Hoboken. The second pillar is really automotive catalysts, which is a very well-known business within Umicore. And the thing that we are discussing today is really around batteries. And we occupy the battery supply chain from, let's say, raw materials through to refining, then to precursor production, and finally the cathode production, which is then shipped to our cell. We are actually active in the different regions, Asia as well as Europe, as well as US.
Katerina, please.
Yes, so Kuehne Nagel is one of the global leading logistics providers. We have 80,000 employees. Our core services are sea freight, air freight, road logistics, integrated logistics, warehousing. I'm head of automotive and new mobility. Supporting the new mobility industry is core of what we do, especially in the battery sector. We do reefer container shipments. We transport batteries via air, via road. We make sure that you as a customer have a compliant, affordable, and traceable logistics solution in the world.
All right, thank you very much. Now let's start with the first section. Why does it matter and what can be done? Selina, shall I start with you? So your company's lithium-sulfur battery technology is quite new, and it avoids cobalt and nickel, two critical materials linked to ethical and geopolitical concerns. So how does this innovation help support localization of EV battery supply chains, especially in the United States where your company is based, and when do we see that commercialized?
Yeah, okay, so it is a new chemistry, and we are really planning to commercialize this and have our first products for mass market sale in a few months, small volumes, okay? It takes a long time to commercialize a chemistry. Lithium sulfur is difficult, but why do we do it? We do it because there is a huge abundance of sulfur and lithium in the world. We also make a carbon that we start with methane, or we start with heavier hydrocarbons. We make the carbon backbone for the sulfur ourselves. So when we look at a lithium sulfur chemistry, what it means is you could produce the raw materials and produce these cells almost on every continent on Earth, because you need sulfur, you need some kind of hydrocarbon to make the graphenes that we make, and you need lithium. Sulfur and lithium can be extracted from the subsurface. In fact, most of our sulfur comes out of the petrochemical industry as a byproduct as we desulfurize our fuels. And it is very abundant and very cheap, right? Lithium can also be extracted from the subsurface. We don't do it right now. It's been cheaper to get sulfur from the sort of near surface in Chile and so forth, or lithium. But with lithium, you can extract it from the subsurface. So what you can think about is, if you have a petrochemical extraction industry, if you have oil fields, you should be able to also produce all the materials you need to make lithium-sulfur batteries from those same fields. In fact, you could probably even recomplete a lot of your wells that you've already drilled and use those products to make lithium-sulfur batteries, which is huge from a standpoint of being able to scale this technology, because really, you already have all the extractive industry in place that you need to get the raw materials, which that's different. You do not have to open a bunch of new mines. You just have to use the resources you already have. And that means that you don't have these long supply chains. It means you don't have this long post-processing that you have to do of the refined minerals that people use for making lithium-ion cells. That's a game changer, and it means that every country can have its own battery manufacturing with lithium sulfur and its own raw material supply chain. It democratizes all of the battery making.
When do we see it commercialized? You forgot to answer that.
Yeah, I'm planning to start shipping to some customers in August.
All right, thank you very much. So Stefan, Umicore is building sustainable supply chains and closing the loop for critical materials, and Europe hopes to building a local supply chain. However, the concept of local for local is under a lot of stress. So how does Umicore see this?
Good question, by the way. I think our view, Umicore's view, is a bit nuanced and pragmatic here. So Umicore clearly supports and really pushes for localization in Europe. But as well, we have to recognize as well that there is quite a bit of investment needed to support this. And so what we come to the conclusion and really want to push for is to use our global footprint at this moment in time, fill those capacities first to be able to supply all this CAM material to the different regions. It's only when the demand will pick up that we will then further look at investing into further growing the capacities to support the regions. I think what we also are maybe a bit unique is that from a global perspective, we are actually supporting that. And we are embracing, let's say, the partnership approach together with Asian players, with other players, global players. So really to form the partnerships that are necessary to really accelerate this mobility, EV mobility question. I think ultimately another way at looking at is really about localization and about local content requirements. This will absolutely be driven by the battery regulation, and over time companies are actually motivated to refine in Europe as well as process the CAM materials. So really refining and manufacturing will be becoming more and more of a requirement in Europe. Is it happening today? Not yet, and as I said, this is really demand driven. The last thing that I really want to highlight here is the circularity. Making sure that we build a closed loop system that can support the retaining of the raw materials, which, by the way, Umicore doesn't have a lot, to actually keep that in Europe, refine it here, and then continue to work with the European players, and then also continue to recycle and bring that into the CAM facilities.
Thank you, Stefan. How about you, Katalin, from a logistics point of view? What are the advantages of having battery production closer to end use?
Yeah, so we see that currently our customers are mainly sourcing from Asia, still being raw materials, but also full batteries. Currently we have adapted to that because we are a logistics provider. We don't produce, we don't set trends, or we don't define where the market is, right? So we essentially, we adapt to what all of our customers require in terms of logistics challenges, and currently it is Asia inbound to Europe, but also of course to other places in LATAM and US. And we are, what we do is, as I said, we have reefer containers, we have air freights, all customized in order to have a safe logistics transportation. However, how will this change? And you know, I mean, if you localize your supply chain, you can optimize your stock. But currently, unpredictabilities in the market, right? We all know how sea freight markets are very unpredictable. Yeah, so things are happening in the market, port closure strikes. You know about the Suez Canal, which has been closed for 1.5 years now. So I think our customers, they need to adapt to supply chain interruptions all the time. And the further you are away from destination and origin, the more complicated it gets. So it's not impossible because we have our tools, we support our customers, we give traceability, and secure transportation. But I think things can become very much more plannable, right? And much more resilient in the supply chain. However, the total cost element, right? Currently, I think it's still the best option in terms of total cost. Yeah, even though it involves a lot of CO2, transport, time, warehousing cost, I think the total cost still pays off at the time. And I think once our local customers start to really produce batteries here in Europe, this will change. And I agree with you, Stefan, the government incentives need to be here because the companies alone, they will not, they have too many options, to source very far away. In terms of CO2, this is quite not a good balance,
Thank you very much. And all of you have already touched on the barriers to scaling up the localization of battery production and logistics. Now let's move on to the next bit about how can we accelerate localization. I think that is something that all of us here are quite interested in. So Selina, how about we start with you again? So how important are policy incentives in making local supply chains commercially viable, and are they delivering the expected impact?
Yeah, so this is something which I agree. Government policy has a huge role to play in this because it creates the driver, right? And I'll give an interesting example. So I was at Panasonic during COVID, okay? I was at the Gigafactory in Reno, and COVID started. And at that point in time, the Gigafactory in Reno was Panasonic cells. There were like 300 technical advisors from Japan working in the factory alongside about 4,000 people trying to make cells. And, that factory, I mean, we were struggling to become cell makers in the United States. People that had never worked in batteries were now running winding machines and coating machines and so forth and learning. And it was very difficult. And, there had been talk already for 3 years that, when was the US factory going to stand on its own feet, right? Because we had all these people from Japan at great cost sitting there with us working. And then COVID happened. And then 300 people, engineers, operators, the most technical people, all went back to Japan. And those of us that were in the US were there on our own and realizing, okay, first we have to shut down the factory because there was a shutdown for COVID. Then we have to restart a factory. And these factories, they're not meant to stop, ever. Okay, so we didn't even know how we were going to restart this factory, right? And we had to do it with just the United States staff, okay? And before, every time people talked about, let's cut back on the, help from our Japanese colleagues, let's, stand on our own feet, there was always a reason. There was always a reason not to, your productivity wasn't as high unless you had these people coming in and helping. But COVID eliminated all those excuses. Suddenly, there was no choice. You had to do this. We had to ramp that factory ourselves, okay? And this shifted that factory, and it shifted the mentality of everyone in the factory. And people forget this, that they think, this factory, you just tell people what to do, they're going to do it. It's not. every single person in that factory has to have in their mind that they are now going to do this thing, okay? And there is no excuse, and there is no one going to come and help save them from somewhere else, okay? And we got the factory restarted. And after that experience, and then, we had now another year or so where we had to run the factory ourselves. We had to do the continuous improvement. It brought the factory to the place where it could stand on its own feet, where it no longer needed to have 300 people from Japan there overseeing and helping to do this work. This is something where government policy does the same thing. It says, okay, you are going to do this thing internally. You're going to build these factories. You're going to continue to produce until you can produce a product. Okay? Without that external push, everyone will always say, well, it's kind of easier. It's easier if we get help from the outside. It's easier if we buy these things from overseas. We can always buy it cheaper from overseas. And it stalls people. So if you want to accelerate people having, bringing the supply chain up in most of the world, you have to create that incentive, that reason why people have to do it. And government policy is the nicest way to do that, because COVID was not nice. Having to separate like that was very painful and had all kinds of negative implications. But this is where government can really step in. They can create that incentive and make it so people have to do this thing. And then you get success and you go faster.
So policy incentives are quite significant from your perspective. Stefan, so how can Europe secure access to critical raw materials? What do you think? Do you think the government should do more?
Yes, for sure. I think if we really want to bring industrialization back to Europe, we really have to create a regulatory framework that is actually enabling that. And I'll give a few examples. Permission. The permitting process. If you look across Europe, this is very fragmented, difficult, long, expensive. And so we really need a framework that delivers one policy related to permitting. And once it is there, that you can also continue to build upon your permits and further refine that. Another item that definitely needs to be worked on is the funding. If you look in funding across Europe, there's all kinds of different ways of getting access to funding. If we really want to make that difference, I think that really needs to be a bit more communalized. And last thing I think that I would like to highlight is if you look at, and that's maybe also a bit your area, is the barriers to transport, let's say, the waste from one country into the other. It's really unbelievable how difficult and how, different legislation is pushing then the slow down of that, etc. So we definitely need to have a better framework, and if it's there, then of course we can retain all those critical raw materials much better in Europe, recycle them here, and that's then accelerating the European local supply chain.
Katarina?
I think it's the same way. It's the government incentives, and I truly believe it will take another 3 to 5 years, because we have all seen, and that doesn't help. We had this North European battery producer who has been bankrupt, right, over the last few months, and I think it is really sad to see that those things happen, because I think that the demand is one thing, but I think if there would have been a better government support and a real willingness, and I don't mean in a country, but it should be a European-wide, for example, setup to really foster this kind of developments. For us, of course, as a logistics provider, things would change drastically, right? While sea freight is currently at the center point of attention for battery transportation, in the future it would be more road, right? But is there any reliable groupage network for batteries? It doesn't exist currently, right? So it's something like this would need to be built up, because huge batteries, DG, there's a lot of risk related to it, and our networks are not done for this because it is not widely requested. Currently, batteries is a one-to-one transportation. They come in via sea freight. They are on reefer containers. I think all of this would need to be built up. but I don't think that is an issue from a logistics point of view. We would just adapt to wherever the market goes, but I think from an ethical and sustainable way, it should be more local in the future. There's no way. Yeah.
All right, now let's talk about what does it mean for global EV battery supply chains. And Selina, let's start with you again. So, in the pursuit of the localization of battery supply chains, do you think it will lead to fragmentation of global trade?
You know, I don't think so. I mean, if we're looking at electrification, right, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to displace the internal combustion engine in, all these applications, right? There's automotive, but there's even, small engines that we run all kinds of, small devices on, or we run farm equipment on, or we run boats on, and so forth, right? We are trying to change all of this, okay? And really what we're trying to do is create a new industry that is on the scale of the petrochemical and internal combustion engine industry, right? Which is immense. And if you think about it, you don't have one oil company or two oil companies or three oil companies. You have hundreds of oil companies all around the world, right? And they all compete and they all manage to coexist. And, the internal combustion engine, the petrochemical industry really hasn't created fragmentation. It's just industry. And it's everywhere, and every country that wants to have a certain amount of prosperity or middle class prosperity, that has manufacturing, that has an oil industry, that has some kind of a energy industry, they all participate, right? And I think that electrification needs to move in that same direction, because to do what we're contemplating for the world, this is not something that is possible to do out of a few countries, even large countries. Really, this has to become across the world and support everyone's economies and ambitions, and that's not going to cause fragmentation. That's just going to be business.
So localization doesn't mean fragmentation, it could mean more cooperation from your perspective. So
Yeah.
Stefan, with raw materials often imported from outside Europe, how do you make sure that they are responsibly mined?
Yeah, I think if we really talk about responsible sourcing, I think Umicore has been on the forefront and really the pioneer in terms of responsible sourcing. If I talk about cobalt, for instance, where we have already a framework over 20 years, and it initially started around making sure that we were not tapping into artisanal mining, which of course has a lot of risks in terms of child labor, working conditions that are not okay. And as I said, we started that 20 years ago, and we slowly progressed further and further up to a point that today we are being validated and audited by an external third party, that we comply 100% to what we are saying in terms of responsible sourcing. The framework as such started with cobalt and is refined year after year. So it started off with ASM, or avoidance of ASM. Today it's even more looking like environmental issues, really social issues, etc., etc. And again, this is a moving target. It's based on the OECD to start off with, but it's really a moving target, and we will continue to advocate for that. Meanwhile, we have also introduced that to all the other raw materials for our batteries, meaning lithium, nickel, manganese, from who the risks and sustainable risks are completely different. And so we have the same framework, very similar, but the application of it is very different, and we make sure that we are in those different regions there where the raw materials are being produced, which is of course a challenge, because those raw materials are coming from everywhere. So that's really the story about, the continued story about sustainability of raw materials.
Catalina, so how do you think localization would impact your business from your logistics point of view?
Yeah, it would impact, as I said. So it's traditionally really a sea freight product, because we bring all those components to Europe, the cells, but also the finished batteries. There's a warehousing which Would it be required in future? I don't know, because currently you need a buffer stock, because if everything has a transit time of 30, 40 days, you cannot do a just-in-time delivery for batteries. Yeah? So all of this could change. I mean, you could have really close-by production of batteries close to OEMs, and what you would have is more road transportation, as I said. So it would really shift modes. Yeah? Transport modes would shift, and still today there's quite let's say a share of air freight, because for urgent batteries, or also for in the aftermarket. Yeah, something we often forget is that batteries that are all in the car have a lifetime, and they have to be replaced. And I think this is a supply chain which is completely underestimated today, because, for example, is there any way to transport damaged batteries? Almost none, right? So you have a damaged, defect battery, it's very difficult. It's a huge challenge. It's a risk. So what do you do? But it will happen in the future, whilst more and more people transition to e-mobility. So that's a challenge for us in the logistics field. I think it will be less maybe on the inbound side, because it will be more localized. But then in aftermarket, we need to think about, right? Because cars are serviced in all countries. Yeah, and this is, I think, where the industry is not yet really advanced. And I think what we do is we cooperate with partners, with battery producers, to say how can we create a sustainable and compliant product for the return supply chain of batteries. Yeah.
It's estimated by 2035, over half of all passenger car sales will be electric. So we're going to have a lot of demand on EV batteries, especially. Sorry about that. And we only have 2 minutes left, and then very briefly, from all of you, where do we go from here? So how about we start with you, Selina?
Yeah, I think as an international community, I think everyone has understood, climate change is really having a negative impact on us. We have to continue the momentum and continue to work on this. It's difficult, though. And, anyone that's tried to be a cell maker knows it's difficult to be a cell maker. It's difficult to ramp a factory. It's difficult to do these things at scale that we need to do. That's the thing. It's not, you can't just say, oh, we tried and we didn't succeed the first time. We have to keep trying again and again and again. And the governments do need to come in and support strongly for us to continue that momentum. But, people want to do this, okay? They will work that hard. So, just supplying some of the support that's necessary should get us there.
Stefan, very briefly.
Okay, so I think that's building upon what we said before. I think partnerships here in Europe, because if you look at this battery supply chain, it's extremely expensive. Thinking that you can do it all alone is the wrong thing to do. So really partnerships is the way forward, we think. Clearly as well, instead of us in Europe think that we can still recover the time that we have lost versus Asia, because let's realize it, Asia really has a step forward. I think we should really embrace that rather than pushing the Asian players out. We should really embrace that situation and move on, develop the supply chain together with the ones that know and have already progressed quite well. So that's the tapping into the Asian partnerships.
Katerina, you have 10 seconds.
Yes, I saw that. I really believe, my point is, we are living in a times of economic downturn, right? But we should not stop. And I think that's where the government needs to come in, because privately owned companies, they just see car sales numbers going down. They have insecurity because of tariffs and trade wars and all the things happening, wars in the world. So I think there needs to be some help and push. As you said, sometimes you need to force the industry to go and to continue in the transition, and we will support it going forward.
Well, thank you so much for your insight. And once again, Selina, Stefan, and Katerina, thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.